Joining us now is Dr. Vinay Prasad. He's a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, author of a fantastic Substack, of which we'll have a link down in the description. Dr. Prasad, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Great to be back on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go and put this up there on the screen. You talked about Biden's bivalent booster blunder. Look at that alliteration there. Fantastic. I'm amazed that I was able to say it correctly. I quoted heavily from your Sensible Magazine piece and many of the other curated thoughts that you guys have. But we wanted to have you on just to break it down. As a doctor, as an MPH, somebody deeply involved in the field and epidemiology, what do you think that the problem with the current administration's policy on the bivalent booster and Omicron vaccine is for all Americans?
Yeah, so I think that the Biden administration has decided almost unilaterally to set what the regulatory standard would be for a yearly vaccine. It's not just about this year, it's about year after year after year. And what they decided was that we are going to adopt a model that's a little bit like the flu model, where we're going to see if the vaccine can generate antibodies against a sequence that we want to hit in mice. And so this vaccine did come to the U.S. market, being tested in 8 mice for Pfizer and 10 mice for Moderna, and no human beings received the vaccine before it came to the market. Part of the reason they did that was they said that there is an important rush. We got to get it out there. We want to get ahead of the season. But one of the things that has emerged is that very few people actually want this vaccine. It's got a usage of about 7% right now. And so in my mind, that kind of there's a tension in that argument, which is that if it was so important to get, presumably people would have wanted to get it. But people don't want to get it, so presumably they want to see some better evidence. And then I think that unlike other nations, Europe has also moved forward with bivalent vaccines. But our nation is one of the few nations globally that is pursuing the same strategy in a 7-year-old as a 77-year-old. In Europe, they are targeting it for 50-year-olds and above, or in other nations, 65 and above. So we are also going after very young people, and this has naturally, I think, led to mandates in colleges. Places like Yale University, Wellesley, they are mandating the bivalent booster for their ultra low risk 20-year-old population.
Can you talk a little bit more about this 8 mouse situation? Because you hear that and you're like, that sounds crazy, like no human trials and only 8, that doesn't seem sufficient. But as you indicated, this is similar to what they typically do with updating the flu vaccines, right? So why do you think it might be appropriate for a flu vaccine, but may not be appropriate for the updating of the COVID vaccine?
Well, you know, as I have been talking about this issue, one of the things I think is that actually when it comes to flu, we might be able to do a better job. I mean, we're locked into a model we've been doing for 20, 30, 40 years now. We might be able to actually generate better evidence for the flu. As you know, each year, the flu shot can either be a close match or it can be a divergent match, in which case it has limited effectiveness. That's why some seasons it seems like it doesn't do much at all. We could actually try to improve that process and have it be more reliable. But when it comes to the COVID vaccine, I do think there are some salient differences. With flu, what we do is we look over in the eastern hemisphere of the world and the southern hemisphere. We try to predict what strains are going to hit the United States this winter that have not yet come to this country. With the COVID-19 vaccine, they are going back in time to a BA.4/5 parent strain. Right now, we're dealing mostly with BA.5, but there are even new variants yet to come. And they're creating the vaccine against an older virus that's already been circulating in the United States. So I think it's a little bit different than the flu shot. The other differences I see are that when it comes to the COVID-19 shot, I think we'll all agree it's more reactogenic. People have more side effects. People are more likely to be out for a day or so. It's not a big deal, but it is more in that direction. And I think when it comes to the COVID vaccine, what we really want to know is, does each additional dose lower your risk of severe disease or hospitalization? I think it's abundantly clear that no matter how many doses you get, you are going to get some COVID-19. The question is it going to be so bad you end up in the hospital, which we don't want? But if it's going to be like a cold, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to live with that. And proof of that is Rochelle Walensky herself got the shot 1 month later. She's got COVID-19.
So do you have more of, do you have a increased safety concern because of the limited nature of these trials? Or is your concern more around just the efficacy and how much sense does it really make to be having the same policy for a 7-year-old as a 70-year-old, as you said?
Yeah, I have a little bit concern in both domains, but let's talk about the safety. The biggest safety concern, of course, is myocarditis. It's mostly men 16 to 40 and mostly men, 18 to 26. That's the highest risk demographic. And everything we see suggests there's no floor to myocarditis. It's not like after so many doses, it goes to zero. The third dose is about 1 in 10,000 risk, which is very low. But 1 in 10,000 starts to matter when the risk of hospitalization is in that ballpark, or maybe less frequent for, say, a 20-year-old man who's already gotten 3 doses. I mean, their risk of hospitalization is going to be really, really low from ever getting COVID. But let's talk about efficacy. I think it is really important for both this vaccine and other vaccines that when they launch a campaign to vaccinate millions of people, they have some idea about what the vaccine efficacy is, some number. To do that, you have to give it to human beings and follow them out. Now, why does that matter? If the vaccine efficacy comes back really, really low, I think it's going to be very concerning for the American people. People are going to feel like they were cheated a little bit. One clue that it might be very low is that people who have gotten the vaccine are very quickly getting COVID-19. Another clue are 2 studies that emerged, I believe one from Harvard, one from Columbia, where they administered both the old vaccine and the new vaccine to individuals. And they found that they have the same level of BA.5 antibody, suggesting that even though this is a bivalent vaccine, we're not generating anything special against BA.5. To which Peter Marks at FDA said, well, that study is just a little too small. To which I said this is the guy who likes to hang his hat on 8 mice. So, you got to really have some perspective. And then the last thing I'd say is every time you change the sequence in the virus, it is possible you get less myocarditis. It's also possible you get more myocarditis. So I think we have to be open to detecting that safety signal if it were to arise.
Right. And so, Dr. Prasad, some of the meta points that you've really convinced me on, reading your work, is that this is going to have effects on global vaccination, on American trust, and on vaccines, which have far more efficacy, science behind them, longstanding import to society. Do we see any signals yet in that data? Why are you worried about it as a corruption of higher institution trust in the medical system?
Yeah, so I guess my bigger concern here is, of course, that vaccination, the campaigns of vaccination, particularly for measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, polio, these are vital and important global public goods. And I do worry that in response to this and maybe other actions around vaccines and COVID vaccines, that we may be sending the wrong message both within the United States and globally and undermining U.S. trust. We can talk a little bit more about U.S. trust in a second. But when it comes to vaccines, we do see a number of surveys showing a greater reluctance to vaccinate children, not just for the COVID-19 vaccine, but for other vaccines. In my mind, it's inappropriate to equate measles vaccination in children with this vaccination because I think measles is more important. We need to tell people it's more important so that if people were to choose, let's choose measles. And then, we can have the discussion about how important the COVID-19 vaccine is. When it comes to trust, I think the United States, one of the great virtues of this country has been our US FDA has been the premier regulatory agency for 40, 50 years. All the nations of the world look to our FDA, who alone review the clinical study data independently. I think we're losing that trust in a number of ways. Our vaccine regulatory bar is going down, 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 which ironically favors the companies who are making tens of billions of dollars off these products. But I'm not sure it favors the American people who need information. But our bar for other products is going down. We were talking beforehand about the Alzheimer's drug. We have a Lou Gehrig's drug that's controversial, and cancer medicines. The more you lower the regulatory hurdles, by that I mean you make it easier for the company to get their product to the market, it looks like you're very innovative. I mean, you have lots of innovation, but is that innovation actually making people live longer or live better? And I think that's the question that faces the FDA.
So you write in this piece, you say the Biden administration's entire vaccine policy seems to be interested in giving Pfizer and Moderna a perpetual market share for a yearly vaccine, but seems to have no interest in generating credible randomized control trial evidence to inform the public. As such, they fail the American people. So why would they? I mean, maybe it's an obvious question, but is it just political corruption? What are the incentives in the system that would lead this or any other administration to care more about the profitability of big pharma than about the results for the American people?
Yeah, I think this is something that you all cover very nicely on your show. I mean, the incentives, I think, are deeply skewed at the level of the highest levels of government. One incentive is the revolving door incentive, which is that I am not worried that, like some people are, that the administration making decisions is currently receiving payments from Pfizer or Moderna. I think that's very unlikely. But I do think the primary place of employment for people who leave the FDA and people who leave the administration working in healthcare may very well be in the biopharmaceutical sector. I mean, the prior commissioner of the FDA, who I like, Scott Gottlieb, he's on the Pfizer board of directors. And we've done a paper on FDA reviewers. 50% of them go to work for or consult for the biopharmaceutical industry. So I do worry it's very difficult to be a strict regulator if you know there's a 50% chance that after this job is over, which it might be over quite soon, you're going to be on the other side of the table. And I think that's a structural bias in government. I also think that this administration, they have always wanted vaccines and Paxlovid to be the answer. I mean, it's a simple answer. It allows them to feel like they're offering something to the American people, and to some degree, that might be a motivating factor. And then finally, I think that evidence-based medicine is something. By that I mean having good evidence for making clinical decisions. It's always been under threat in biomedicine. It isn't always greed. It's sometimes true belief. It's sometimes wishful thinking. Human beings are wonderful at making ourselves believe like the next medical breakthrough is going to be a success. What is it? The distinguishing feature of man is the desire to take medicine. We really do kind of believe in these things.
That's a great quote. I
haven't heard that one before. I like it.
What's your overall structural takeaway from all of this? Is it like, is there a view for optimism? How can people, if anything, I think is good. People like me, many others, have taken a lot more interest in their overall health and in questioning what exactly these drugs are, what they do, what do they mean whenever they say this. Pfizer says there's a trial. Okay, how many people? What do you think outside of that? Is there any takeaways for the general population who just want to be healthier? If they want their kids to be healthier, everybody just wants to be protected.
Well, I think you're making a good point, which is that there's a takeaway, which is that as it should have always been the case, when you go to see the doctor, you have to be an empowered consumer of healthcare, which means when the doctor makes a recommendation, you have to always ask the question I always like to tell people to ask is, that sounds great, but just for a minute, hypothetically, what if I did nothing? What would happen? And just get the doctor to talk about that. Or if you didn't use this treatment, what would be the other treatment? And why would you choose one or the other? What makes you decide? And I think those kind of questions would really empower us a lot in our day-to-day medical encounters. I think there's a second level of lessons from this is on the Biden administration itself, which is I think that their COVID-19 policy is both a medical liability and a political liability. And there's nothing about being a Democrat that says you have to be for a vaccine campaign annually in perpetuity in 7-year-olds based on mouse data. That's not part of the Democratic platform. That's the unique policy preference of the particular individuals that they are consulting with. There are other people they could consult with who have divergent views. One is Paul Offit, who is an expert in vaccine science, Cody Meissner, who's at Tufts University. I mean, they're not wedded to this group. And I think that the vaccine rollout around young children and this bivalent booster does suggest there's a disconnect between their advisors and the American people. Now, why aren't Americans rushing to get this vaccine, and why didn't they rush to get their under 5-year-old vaccinated? It's probably because they look at their child who mostly already had COVID, or they've mostly just had BA5, and they think to themselves, what's the point? I've gotten 3 shots. I've had this. I've cleared it. I feel okay. I know what it's like. I don't need this shot. And I want to say that there's actually something to that intuition, because I'm not convinced that the shot, it will benefit you, especially if you've gotten 3 doses and you had COVID. And so the American people are voting with their feet, and wisely. And so I think the administration, especially after the election, they may decide that they want to go in a different direction on COVID-19 policy, something that more Americans have buy-in to.
Well,
I would add one to the list, which is, as you really described, we got to close the revolving door, end the revolving door,
Yes.
shut the revolving door, however you want to say it. Get rid of the revolving door. That's the one, because whether it's this administration, the next administration, Republican, Democrat, I mean, we see a lot of these problems repeat themselves over and over again because of the endemic corruption in the system. So that has got to end for people to have more trust in these systems.
100%. Highly recommend following Dr. Prasad's work. We're going to link down in the description to his newsletter. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Great to see you.
Thank you all so much for watching. We really appreciate it. Look, we're doing election night planning. We've got some good hires that we're going to be announcing soon here. I think you'll all be very excited. All of it 100% because of you guys, of premium subscribers. Never been happier to be able to do this. We've got our election night coverage. It's going to be exciting. This is our first real ramp up for an election night. We're going to have a live stream, all of that. Premium subs, you guys will get a first dibs and email about how exactly it's all going to go down. So anyway, link down in the description. We'll have some great content for you tomorrow. And then Friday is also Counterpoints. We'll be here on Thursday as well. So stay tuned. It's going to be a fun time.
See y'all soon. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.